All right, welcome to our explainer. Hijab, Niqab. You've definitely heard these words, but what's the actual, religious story behind them? Well, today we're going to cut right through all the noise and get straight to the sources.
So let's get right to the big question. What really is the fundamental difference between the hijab and the niqab? And maybe more importantly, what do the foundational texts of Islam actually have to say about them? Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's not waste any time. Here's the top-level answer right up front. Pretty much every Islamic scholar agrees that the hijab, which means covering the hair and body with loose clothing, is obligatory. But the niqab, the face covering, that's a different story. The vast majority of scholars see it as recommended or maybe optional. And that distinction is absolutely key. We're going to break down exactly why.
So to really get a handle on both of these, we gotta go back to the source, to the core principle that they both come from, this whole concept of modesty in Islam. You see, modesty in Islam is this really foundational idea, and it's for both men and women. And it's not just about what you wear, it's way bigger than that. It's supposed to be this guide for your behavior, your character, your whole vibe, really. The idea is that your outer dress is just a reflection of that inner state. Okay. So where do the specific rules for women's dress actually come from? Well, for that, we've got to turn to the primary source, the Qur'an. And there are two key verses that scholars always point to. First up is a verse from Surah An-Nur. The main point here, the big instruction, is to draw veils over the chest area. So the focus is on covering the bosom and, not displaying your beauty out in public, except, of course, around close family. And then there's the second key verse from Surah Al-Ahzab, and this one talks about wearing outer garments called a jilbab when you're out in public. And the reason given? It's for recognition, to be modest, and for protection. All right, so here's the really crucial point that scholars always make. While these verses clearly set up the idea of covering the body and the chest, you'll notice something's missing. Neither one, not a single one, explicitly says cover the face. And this right here is the scriptural foundation for why there are different rulings for the hijab and the niqab. So how do we get from those verses to the practice of hijab as we know it today? Well, when you combine that guidance with the traditions of the Prophet, you get a really clear, unified answer from scholars. So the hijab is basically defined as this: covering the hair and the body and making sure the clothing is loose, not tight or revealing. And here's the thing. This practice is considered obligatory, a requirement by a huge consensus of Islamic scholars. We're talking across all the major schools of thought. They're all on the same page here. Okay, but now this is where the conversation gets a little more complex. Because when we start talking about the niqab, the face veil, we move away from that solid consensus and into a world of different scholarly interpretations. And why the different opinions? Well, unlike the super clear instruction to cover the body and hair, the other traditional sources, the hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, they're just not as clear-cut when it comes to the face. This is really where all the nuance comes into play. So if we actually look at the major schools of Islamic law, a really clear pattern starts to show up. The Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and even the majority of Hanbali scholars, they all land in pretty much the same spot. They see the niqab as either recommended or optional. Basically, it's a good thing to do, an act of extra piety, but it's not a must-do. It's not a requirement. And that right there leads us to a really critical takeaway. The idea that wearing a niqab is absolutely mandatory, well, that's actually a minority opinion. It's mostly held by just one segment within the Hanbali school. So the overwhelming majority view? It's not a requirement.
Okay, so we've laid out the differences. Let's circle back now to that core idea we started with, because the sources are really clear that this whole thing is about something way deeper than just a piece of cloth.
Yeah, the source material just puts it so well. See, the physical covering isn't the final goal. It's supposed to be an outward sign of an inner state of modesty, something that guides how you act and what your intentions are. And what is that inner state? Well, it's defined by stuff like your intention, your behavior, your whole character. It's about piety, humility, and just being sincere in your faith and in everything you do. These are the qualities that the clothing is meant to both reflect and protect. And that brings us to one last really powerful point. The real emphasis is put so much more on your internal devotion, your piety, your humility before God, than on the specific style of whatever you're wearing. Meeting the requirement for hijab, that's the mandate. Anything on top of that is really a personal choice.
So, we want to leave you with a question to chew on. If modesty is, first and foremost, an internal state, an inside job, how does that change the way we look at all the external religious practices? And not just in Islam, but think about it, across all faiths. Really makes you think, doesn't it? Thanks for tuning in.